scientist Tony Stewart.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure on behalf of the panel to welcome you to the forum and to welcome our guest today, who is Mr. Thomas Sorensen. He is presently a partner in an investment brokerage firm in New York City. Prior to those endeavors, he has been involved in many activities, including serving as a member of the United States Information Agency for 13 years, located both in Washington, D.C. and served abroad. And for 4 years of that period, he was the agency's deputy director. He has also been vice president of the 9 campuses of the University of California. While in that post, he resigned to manage or be one of the managers of the presidential campaign of the late Senator Robert Kennedy. And in 1970, he served as the campaign manager for his brother Ted. He is an author, in addition to all these other activities, including a book entitled The World War, and has been a contributor to the magazine Parade. He has very special interest in the subject of bigness in government, business, labor, and the news media. Mr. Sorensen, it's a pleasure having you on our program.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here.
I also today would like to welcome back our 3 regular panel members. To my far left is Mr. Richard Heineman, who is a member of the faculty at North Idaho College, serving in the Division of Communication Arts, and is at the present time completing his doctorate from Washington State University. Also on the panel is Mrs. Mary Lou Reed, who is very well known in both political and environmental issues within this state and the Northwest, and received or did her work in the field of theology at Columbia University. And also on the panel is Dr. Ken Wright, who is chairman of the Division of Physical Sciences at North Idaho College with his degree from the University of Idaho. We'll proceed to questions at once, and the first question from Mr. Heineman.
Mr. Sorensen, Emerson once wrote that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. And I wonder that if the alleged breakdown of ethics in the corporations today is because of the type of individuals who hold these positions of corporate responsibility, or do you think that there might be something inherently wrong in the corporate structure itself as it exists today, which could lead to a breakdown in ethics?
I don't think that there are many things wrong with the corporate structure, but I don't think there's anything inherent in the corporate structure that brings about a decline in ethics, and I don't necessarily subscribe to your premise that there is a marked decline in corporate ethics. I suspect, in fact, that corporate ethics are much better today than they were 20 years ago, or 40 years ago, or certainly 100 years ago when the robber barons were running rampant in this country. But I agree with Emerson absolutely that the tone is set by the leader. And we don't need any more proof in this country of what Emerson said after our experience of the last 2 years with an administration where there was decay from the top, and it affected the entire institution.
Fine, thank you.
Mrs. Reed.
Mr. Sorensen, your topic today is going to be bigness, and could you tell us why you feel that bigness per se is a difficult and a dangerous thing working in the United States, in the media and unions and corporations?
Well, I want to be careful about saying that bigness per se is bad. Let's go on now to subject number 2. Why is it bad? And I don't think per se bigness is necessarily bad. Big basketball players are much better than small basketball players. There are times when big companies often can produce more efficiently, can give their workers better benefits and better salaries than tiny, struggling, hand-to-mouth companies can. We don't always praise the telephone monopoly in this country to the sky, but I can tell you as one who travels a great deal abroad that we have a much better telephone system in the United States than anywhere else. Once you get the dial tone, and once you could find a dime, Or it's going up to 20 cents now some places. So my point is that that bigness can be good and it can be bad. It depends on the situation. It depends on the people. And it makes most of us feel when something gets so big that that it becomes impersonal, it becomes out of our reach, it becomes out of our control. And I'm originally a Westerner or a Midwesterner, and I have that what I think is a kind of Western frontier reaction. We don't like all these big giants, but and there are problems as our society and our economy has gotten more sophisticated. But I don't think that we can say, bigness is bad. How are we going to cut it down and make what's big small? I don't think that's the approach.
Well, do you feel that we should be trying to decentralize some of these operations to alleviate these senses of frustration that people have from big, complex organizations?
I think that decentralization of initiative, and decentralization of responsibility, decentralization in many cases of allocating resources and controlling the spending of money, whether it's for government or a corporation, is a good idea. But again, I'm going to dispute myself. Tell me which is more honest and more efficient and more effective in cost terms, the federal government or the government of the city of Chicago? I'm just asking the question, not answering it. Which over the last 20 years generally has been more honest? Bureaucrats in the national government or bureaucrats who work for the state of Massachusetts? Just because small, again, my point is small is not necessarily better. Often it's better. Often it can be. People in this corner of Idaho ought to be able to know better what their problems are and what the solutions ought to be than some know-it-all who sits far away in Washington. And that's often true. Well, we're testing that now because the expenditures by state and local governments, as you know, has been rising at a much faster rate than the expenditures by the federal government. And one problem with the federal government is that once you start something, it never stops. It just seems to go on forever, whether you need it or not. I see bad signs that many of the state and local governments are now imitating the federal government. They have the same basic problems of an ongoing bureaucracy. But there is a return now to decentralization, but I don't think we should say to ourselves, well, we're decentralizing, now everything is going to be fine, let's turn our attention somewhere else. It's going to have to be managed very carefully, or the pendulum will swing the other way and people will go to Washington as they did in 1933 and say, save us from the sins and errors and omissions of local government.
You suggest that you aren't going to give us any easy answers.
I don't think there are any very easy ones, and I'm not even sure I know all the questions, to say nothing of all the answers.
Dr. Wright.
Mr. Sorensen, you just mentioned a little while ago about the fact that our economy has grown more sophisticated. You've been a campaign manager for Senator Robert Kennedy and also for your brother Ted Sorensen, and as a campaign manager you have to certainly assess the public. I'm wondering if you think the public has become any more sophisticated along with our economy.
Oh, well, it depends on what time span you're looking at. I don't think there's any question that the public is better educated about public affairs, is better informed, is more interested in what is happening and what the problems are. Now, that doesn't mean that the public is perfectly informed or that people take as much interest as they should. We have a shockingly low turnout of voters in this country every election. And the election of November 1974 was no exception. But I don't think there's any question, as the level of education has risen in the country, and television is really a national medium that we never had before. We don't have a national newspaper in this country, really, as they do in Britain and as they do in many other countries. And I think people are more sophisticated, and I think, although it took them a while, that the public reaction to the whole Watergate business was healthy, and a sign of that. Now, lots of people said they got tired of it. I don't quite know what that means. You know, I'm awfully tired of hearing about unemployment too, especially if I'm unemployed. But I think people are a lot more sophisticated and a lot more prepared to deal with a lot better prepared to deal with the problems of this country than they used to be, and it's a darn good thing too, because the problems are so much more complex.
Well, for a time span, I was thinking of the last 15 years, like since 1960, when we've really grown tremendously. I'm wondering if you think the public has kept pace with the tremendous complexity of our economic problems. We hear so much about our economic problems right now, and there's so many different solutions being bandied about. I wonder if you think the public, despite the fact that they are better informed, have they been able to keep pace, do you think?
Well, I don't think the public is supposed to be experts in the money supply and the velocity of M1 and M2, and that I don't think that the public should understand, and I certainly don't, everything that Arthur Burns says about what the Federal Reserve System is doing in their open market operations. But I am convinced that the collective wisdom of the public is pretty good, and that sometimes too slow to anger, occasionally too quick to make a decision. True that they don't understand many of the fine esoteric points of the economy and or the quarrel, let's say, between the Keynesians and the monetarists. But the public's judgment is not bad, and when they exercise that judgment at the polls, by and large, they do all right, which is why I think democracy still works quite well, even as problems get more difficult. I'd rather have the people deciding than have some self-appointed all-wise ruler telling us this is what we shall do.
Mr. Sorensen, I would like to really ask a couple of questions on something you've already commented on that create interest in my thinking process along these lines, and I'm going to be quite cynical and play the devil's advocate for a while we do this. If I understood you correctly in response to Mr. Hyman's question, you made the comment that you felt that in business, in particular big business, that ethics were better than they were many years ago at the turn of the century. If that be the case, how does one explain in relation to the population or our citizenry that polls by Harris and Gallup and others find that people are more cynical toward their government and big business than they were just a few years ago, and also the episodes that we've experienced with IT&T and the petroleum companies and their maneuvering within our country in recent years? Is this not the case that large corporations might have just become more subtle in how they go about influencing the whole process of decision-making and profit-making by corporations? What I'm speaking of is, it is true that earlier in this century there was very little regulation on corporations, but now that they are regulated, have they not just diverted their influence to the government officials who regulate them and are able to place some of their key people on key regulatory commissions?
Well, that's a long question, and the answer is maybe. No, let me give you more of an answer than that. The fact that the public is more cynical about business now than it was a few years ago doesn't necessarily mean that business is any worse. The public attitude about business the line goes right along with the line of the economy, and when you have high unemployment, as we do now, and particularly at a time when there's been high inflation, as we still do now, although the rate's beginning to come down the hard way with the recession, people are more cynical about the way business works, the way the economy works. When things are great and everybody's taking home his weekly paycheck and getting a raise every 6 or 8 months, you hear very little cynicism except in the academic community, which has always been cynical about business, and that's part of the academic community's job, to be cynical about business, and I welcome that. But I hear what you're saying about the regulatory agencies, and there have been some abuses, and one problem is that that the agencies become too close to the businesses they are, to the industry that they're regulating, whether it's the Federal Communications Commission, which regulates the airwaves in this country, or the CAB, which regulates the airlines and so on. But I work in the securities business, and I can tell you that both in the regulation by the government and in the self-regulation by the industry, which was called for by the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934, there just isn't any comparison to what it was in the dog-eat-dog, no rules, all bets are off days that preceded the 1930s. The securities business is so regulated, both by the government and by the industry, that the New York Stock Exchange has a rule covering everything from coming out to Coeur d'Alene and making a speech. I have to submit that to the New York Stock Exchange as an allied member, and they want to know what you said, and they want to know why you said it, and they want to know what you do. They watch the tape on trades, on transactions. It is an auction market. If there is any inside buying, there's a rule against inside buying or selling within a certain period of time. The amount of rules in the securities business fill books this large. Now, I'm not saying there aren't some people that I don't think have perfect morals in the securities business, because there aren't. They are no more paragons of virtue than anyone else. Why, they probably are not even any better than college professors. But what I am sure of is that what is true now is vastly, vastly different from what was true even 40, 45 years ago. The people who are in big at the top of big institutions often suffer. It was true before, and it's true today, and it'll be true tomorrow. From what the Greeks called hubris. It's an arrogance of power. And they think that because they are big, and because they have so much resources at their command, that their word is law. That was the basic trouble behind Watergate, and behind the people in that administration. It was the basic problem of, I think, a man like Harold Janine, who's chairman of the board of ITT, who is no crook, by the way, but whose company was growing, and the profits were growing every year, and he began to feel, that he was the world's greatest manager, and things could forever get better.
Well, then we have these examples that you point out, such as IT&T. There's certainly been much discussion of what happened in relation to foreign policy and Watergate concerning that, and the milk interests and so forth. Now that we know these examples certainly exist, do you have any particular proposals how we might try to combat some of these abuses? I'm not taking a position either that one eliminates all of these problems, but are there any things that we can do?
There are lots of things that we can do. One is enforce the law. Number one, there was a law on the books since the 1920s forbidding corporate contributions to political campaigns. Corrupt Practices Act of 25 or 26, something like that. That thing has been on the books for 50 years, and corporations were paying bonuses to officers who then in turn would make political contributions, or they were laundering money in one way or another that was corporate money, that is to say pre-tax money, that being the important reason why corporate contributions are outlawed, because then it becomes a business expense. And they have to pay taxes on the money, whereas other corporate contributions, unlike what you give to the Red Cross, when you make a political contribution, you earn your money and then you pay a tax on it, and then what's left you can give to a political campaign. So these were pre-tax contributions. That's been illegal for 50 years, and I don't think there were ever any prosecutions under that act until a couple of years ago. Well, it became one of those laws that people began to flout, first a little bit and then a lot, because they said nobody really cares. So the first thing we can do is enforce the law. The second thing we can do as Americans, as individuals, as groups, we can say we demand honesty in our government and in the big institutions. Different cultures have different standards which have grown up. In some countries, nobody pays his fair share of taxes. I mean, it's unheard of. There's a tax law in the books, but you dodge your taxes. In this country, despite the fact that there's some fiddling around with taxes, it's a fantastic situation. Every April 15, several 100 million Americans voluntarily file tax returns and pay not enough to cover expenses, but pay $300 billion or thereabouts to the Internal Revenue Service, making out their own tax returns. This is the world's greatest example of voluntary compliance with regulations. In some cultures, the kickback is perfectly acceptable. In ours, it's not. I think we have to make clear to people in government and people in business that we want a high standard of integrity. You get the kind of government and you get the kind of corporations that you deserve, I think. And when people say, when they're stopped for a speeding ticket, here's $10 to the policeman, I don't want to hear any complaints from that man about corruption in government. He is a corrupter. When a businessman gives a kickback, he is a corrupter. When people say, oh, that's just politics, as so many people said over the last 2 years, enraging me, it's not just politics. Politics, by and large, in this country nationally, are honest, and politicians are honest men, by and large. And the people who work in the bureaucracy are honest people, by and large, and people of ability. And it is those who are not who stain the others, but they have collaborators in the public. The collaborators being every man and woman who says, oh, that's just politics, everybody does it. Because that's baloney, everybody doesn't do it, and when you say that, you are in effect putting the seal of approval on it. So the main thing we can do is say, look, we don't go along with these kinds of standards in business or in government, in City Hall or in Washington, and we demand a high standard, and we play our part by in our own lives and in our own dealings with others, having the kind of ethical tone that we expect from people in higher places.
Mr. Heinemann.
Well, Mr. Sorensen, corporations today have a dual responsibility, of course, first to the stockholders and then to the general public. But don't you think that the corporations will remain responsive to the public needs, public interests, only as long as the government is standing in the wings to keep them honest? In other words, let's go back to the steel strike.
Do you think that college professors will meet the public interest only as long as the government is standing in the wings and keeping them honest?
No, not necessarily.
Well, is there a higher standard of ethics among college professors than among business executives? I'm asking the question.
Well, I would say so, that we police ourselves more than industry polices itself. The ABA, the American Bar Association, polices itself. The American Medical Association has a code of ethics. Academia has their own code of ethics. But I don't see any code of ethics set up for industry.
Oh, there's many industries have a code.
Where they police themselves?
Oh, well, as I mentioned, the securities industry is self-policed up to here.
What about the steel industry? The auto industry?
The auto industry, they do have codes, but the question is whether those codes are entirely in the public interest. Of course, there has to be legislation, and that's why state legislatures legislate about the number of hours that a college professor has to teach, and legislate on tenure, and that's why the Congress has to legislate on the automobile industry. Safety standards, long overdue. Emission standards, long overdue. But I reject I've had several incarnations. I've been in education, I've been in business, I've been in government. And I reject the idea that there is one group of the population that is more or less moral, more or less ethical, has a more or higher or a lower standard than some other group. There are individuals in each of these groups who vary greatly. There are people in corporations who cheat on their expense accounts, and there are people in colleges who cheat on their expense accounts. But I do not think that that in these different segments of our society that any one group can say, you know, we are people of higher standards, and so we should set standards for you. All must operate in the public interest, and I think there is some government regulation and certainly some considerable public interest, which may or may not take the form of regulation, in the activities of all.
Well, now, do you believe that the size of today's corporations make it responsive or to the public interest?
Well, most of the corporations in this country are very small. Most of them, probably 90% of them are, you could get the entire...
well, let's take the large one. Let's take the large corporation.
You could get the entire employees and stockholders in this room. But now, so the question is about the large corporations, the very large, the super large corporations.
Yes.
And what about them?
The question is, do you think that they are, because of their size, it makes them less responsive to the needs of our society as a whole?
I suspect that because of their size, they are that much more visible to the public and to the Justice Department and to the regulatory agencies. And while I am not satisfied that the automobile industry, for example, where it's dominated by 3 companies and a smaller fourth, in the U.S., has been or is today as responsive to the public interest as it should be, it's very difficult. It's impossible for them to do anything out of sight because those companies are so visible. And the positions that Henry Ford II takes, and the position that Mr. Murphy, the new head of General Motors, takes, are very visible because these companies are so enormous. As enormous companies, they also wield enormous economic power. A great many people are dependent on them, and when the automobile industry has great layoffs, as they've had in the last several months, this sends a ripple effect through the whole economy, not just affecting Detroit and the area around Detroit. But because they're big, they're also watched in a way that they never were 50 or 100 years ago.
And they have to be watched.
And they should be, because of the enormous power that they have.
One brief last question here. Have you been able to discern whether foreign corporations seem to have a higher standard of ethics than American corporations? By foreign, pardon, I mean England, English, French, German.
My impression, and it's empirical, is that to the contrary, that foreign corporations have a lower standard of ethics than but we're talking about corporations. Corporations don't have ethics. People who run them. And by and large, I think that the business ethics in the United States, and I'm president of an international division of our little company, and I go abroad a good deal, and I talk to people abroad. They don't have the regulation in many countries that we have in this country, but beyond that, the the feeling that companies must pay attention to the public interest, which is relatively new in this country, still hasn't caught up abroad. And I think your basic assumption could well be wrong. I don't know, it's a little hard to prove whether, who has the highest standard of ethics, but I would not make the flat assumption that they are better abroad than they are in this country.
Fine, thank you.
Mrs. Reed.
Well, may I suggest that there are different types of corporate responsibility, and it has been said that the quality of life suffers whenever the gross national product becomes the primary national social goal. And is it truly responsible to spend as much money as the corporations do on advertising, trying to sell people things that they don't necessarily need or they may not want, and perhaps establishing images that they cannot achieve? Is this not something that is overdone in the corporate world?
Well, it's a tricky question. It probably is overdone. Growth, certainly for the sake of growth, we have found out requires a high price. Of course, we weren't engaged in that just for the sake of growth, because growth means jobs, and the labor market has been ever expanding in this country. When you say that advertising makes people buy things they don't want and don't need, you're saying that people are too dumb to know what's good for themselves. And as a Democrat with a small d as well as a large d, I don't really subscribe to that.
There's a difference between being dumb and being impressionable.
Well, people
I'm
are.
not saying that dumb. I'm just saying that we all have our weaknesses towards the soft or the hard sell.
Well, you and I are able to make decisions about what we should buy and what we shouldn't buy, aren't we?
Yes, I'm not saying.
But you're saying we ought to. There's some people out there who we ought to protect against themselves.
Well, certainly children. I think that they're sold an awful lot of cereal that is good for their teeth.
Who buys the children? Buys the cereal? The children or their parents?
Well, the parents are very susceptible to what their children want.
Well, you're saying I hear what you're saying, and a lot of that junk cereal is horrible. I mean, I walk very fast past it in the supermarket. I don't even like to look at the boxes, and we'll stay away from brand names. But if the cereal was not purchased by the parents, in the marketplace, I mean, I believe in the marketplace a controlled with controls to keep it from careening out of totally out of control. But if parents are not buying that stuff, the companies who make it are going to stop making it very, very quickly. Now, when we start saving people from themselves and playing the big daddy, I have to take a look at who's making the decision as to what cereal is good for my kids and what isn't good if I don't make that decision. Is somebody in Washington that much smarter than I am who is going to decide what kind of cereal my little boys eat?
Well, there's another kind of advertising that maybe you might address, and we have seen in the last year the power in the oil companies spend an awful lot of money to try and convince us that they are really doing good things for the country. And some others have said that, what's the one about America has more coal, let's dig it. Are these not...
Yeah, that's the electric power systems.
Now, is this not attempting to use advertising to convince people to change? Is this not using advertising for political goals?
Well, what are the political goals of the oil company?
Well, they want to convince the public that it's in their best interest to follow their ideals.
Well, they want to convince the public that what they're doing is right.
Right.
Well, don't they have the same access to the marketplace as everybody else? There are lots of people who are saying that the oil companies are villains. Scoop Jackson says the oil company profits were obscene. In a famous phrase of about a year ago. I'm for letting the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazis and the American communists and the oil companies and everybody have their say.
But Exxon has an incredible amount of money to spend to try and convince us, and most people do not have this at their beck and call.
You mean to say that the amount of material that appears in the media, contrary to the Exxon view, isn't at least equal or greater than what Exxon puts forth in its advertising? It is, isn't it? So we can reject Exxon's views, or reject some of their views, accept others, listen to what they have to say. I don't think we should be afraid of ideas, even if they come from oil companies. Sometimes they might have a good idea. Ford said in their advertising that Ford had a better idea. I've been waiting to hear what it is. But actually, we've gotten, I'm getting slightly off the subject, but it's important. There's sometimes we get some leadership out of corporate executives. I've been telling my friends in the last 6 months that I think we're getting a lot of leadership from Ford. Henry, more than Gerald. He has spoken out candidly, and several months ago, I thought quite perceptibly about what was happening to the economy and what difficult things needed to be done to get it righted. So I repeat, I'm an old-fashioned Democrat with a small d, and I like everybody to have their say, even if they're presidents of oil companies.
You're so liberal.
Dr. Wright.
I've got several juicy areas I'd like to get into, but since we got into this thing about advertising, I have to ask this question. Do you think that what most economists call natural monopolies, and I'm thinking specifically of public utilities, should be advertising at all, especially advertising for their services, trying to get the public, say, to use more telephones, to install electric heat and buy electric appliances, and in general advertising their services rather than just simply their availability?
It's a good question. I never understood why they did it. The electric utility in the area where I live was advertising buy more, use more electricity up to a certain point, and within about a 48-hour period they switched to save a watt, cut down, save here and save there. And maybe advertising is a good idea where they're trying to get people to move to a more efficient use, and help, as an educational way, help people to save energy, because we waste so much energy in this country, householders and industry, and automobile drivers especially. But I agree with you. It seems ridiculous to have all this advertising by the telephone company, for example, about how wonderful they are. We'll find out how wonderful they are when we pick up the phone and use it.
You would say then that we probably ought to regulate it, but I've asked this question of a number of people, and they don't see much hope for getting such a bill through Congress to stop this practice.
Well, the phone companies are regulated by state regulatory agencies. I'm not sure you have to go to Congress. I think you get the state. I'm not that familiar with the way it works in this state, but you get the State Utilities Commission or whatever regulatory commission you have, which regulates the internal rates of the telephone company, the infrastate rates, and of the utilities, and they can probably pass some kind of regulation about the expenditures of money on advertising. I wouldn't want to pass any regulation about what they can say, because even the First Amendment applies to telephone companies. I'm so liberal. Even willing to let the telephone companies enjoy the benefits of the First Amendment. But there could be, and maybe should be, some kind of regulation on how much advertising money they spend to tell us how great they are, when we don't have any alternatives unless we want to stretch a string between two tin cans, and that doesn't work very well. I tried it when I was a kid.
I'd like to get into a question with you concerning corruption in government and growth in government. Before doing that, I cannot resist showing my bias or prejudice that Mr. Hyman brought up, and that is, is it not really a fact of reality that a college professor who teaches 150 students and makes $14,000 a year would have less influence with the president than a businessman who contributes, I think of one in particular in this country, in the last campaign contributed $1 million to one of the political parties. In other words, how do we get those people on equal par and influence decision-making as these things are brought out? And while making that preface, let's refer to government. During the Johnson and Kennedy years in the White House, we had our Billy Saul Estes and Bobby Baker cases and many scandals that came out of that and influence peddling in government. Then the Republicans came in and they were going to clean up government, and they had Watergate. We just have all these examples before us, and the late Senator Robert Kennedy went to the Senate and became probably the #1 spokesman opposing wiretapping. And yet recently we hear from FBI reports that have been made available that he was very active in wiretapping with some rather prominent Americans while Attorney General of the United States. After all this comes before the people, and each candidate comes forth and is going to clean up government, and then we get this documentation later. How are we going to convince the American people not to be cynical toward what's happening in big government in this country?
Well, first we have to convince you before we can convince the American people, and I don't think we have enough time to do that today. But just a couple of comments on what you said. The contribution of the poor college professor as opposed to the big businessman who contributes $1 million. Aside from the fact, I'm glad to say, you can't contribute $1 million anymore under the new legislation. Let's look back over the last 25 years, and you tell me who had more influence on the course of government, college professors or big businessmen? I served in government a long time, and I'll tell you it's college professors by far. By far. Ken Galbraith, Paul Samuelson, half the people in the Roosevelt administration, 3/4 of them in the Kennedy administration. Walter Heller, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, used to call President Kennedy his student in economics. He said, I'll give him an A-. He's doing very well. And Walter Heller had enormous influence over the economic policies of the Kennedy administration. Arthur Okun in the Johnson administration. Professor Arthur Burns, who's now head of the Federal Reserve Board. Professor Paul McCracken in the Eisenhower and Nixon administrations. We have Professor George Shultz from the University of Chicago, who was Secretary of the Treasury and head of the Budget Bureau. Don't downgrade the contributions or the power of professors in Washington. It has been enormous. Now, as far as their salaries are concerned, I'm not going to get into that. I mean, I wouldn't touch that with a 10-foot pole. Professors are underpaid both in their colleges and in Washington. The people who make corporate contributions, this is the way they will argue. They claim that this is a direct result of the building up of this fabric of regulation in this country. And they say, you know, we have to contribute money so, not that so that we can then, you know, make some kind of special deal in Washington after the election, but so we're going to be able to talk to somebody in the ABC or the DEF or the HJK or whatever regulatory agency it is. And they also say, and it's a stupid argument that we hear from our kids, everybody else is doing it, they say, well, my competitors are all contributing money, and if I don't contribute money, maybe I'll, you know, be on the short end when it comes up. So one of the products of building up a regulatory system, and I'm for it, but that one of the byproducts has been the great increase in corporate contributions. But now, what Billy Saul Estes, who the Junior Chamber of Commerce selected as one of the 10 outstanding young men in the country a year before he was caught with his balance sheet down, what he has to do with anybody's administration is beyond me. I mean, don't tell me if there's a big snowstorm out here, you're going to blame it on the Ford administration. Bobby Baker was an assistant to the Senate Majority Leader, Lyndon Johnson, but he never went to he wasn't in the executive branch. And in fact, when Baker got into trouble, Lyndon Johnson's attitude was Bobby who. I mean, you know, he dropped him like a hot potato. But that aside, if you are too cynical about the influence that the ordinary citizen can have in Washington, or the ordinary college professor, and I'm sure you're not an ordinary one, you're an extraordinary one, but if you're too cynical about that, what you're doing is playing in the hands of the guys of the hubris, the guys who say, those people out there don't really count. In an interview that he gave with the Washington Star-News a week before the inauguration in 1973, January 1973, then President Nixon said something enormously revealing. He said, you know, the American people are like children, and they need to be guided and directed and led to do the right thing. Well, now, you know, bells should have gone off in everyone's head at that moment if they hadn't gone off years before, because the American people are not like children. But if you say, oh, Lord, there's nothing we can do about it, those people in Washington have so much power and the big businessmen are there, so I'm not going to vote, which is the lowest common denominator of saying there's nothing we can do, and so many people don't vote in this country as a result. Think of the people who didn't vote in New Hampshire. They haven't decided yet who won the Senate seat. Did Durkin win by 2 votes, or did Wyman win by 1 vote? Every vote counts. But people who don't vote are playing in the hands of politicians who then are elected on a minority basis, or who say, well, the public doesn't care, or the public's turned off, so we can do anything we want to do. So by being cynical, even maybe there's an element of truth in what you say, by being cynical, you're playing into the hands of the people who say we can manipulate the public. So the first thing to do, I think, is to swing the other way and to assume that you have power as an individual, and collectively that the people have power, and to raise a little stink when things don't go. Write letters to the newspapers. Write letters to your congressmen. Congressmen and senators read those letters with trembling hands. Don't let anybody tell you that they don't, and they count their mail, and they are affected.
I must go out the panel, but I wanted to say in response to this that I can assure you that I'm not a person that is not involved. I'm very involved, but I'm playing the devil's advocate, and you're stimulating our conversation very much. Mr. Hyman.
All right. Get off another area, political campaigns. Last week I think it was in James Reston's analysis of the Democratic candidates running for president, announced and unannounced. And he mentioned, for all intent and purposes, that none of them really had any clout, that none of them could seriously challenge President Ford, and that as a result, it was virtually inevitable that the Democratic Party would turn to Senator Ted Kennedy and ask him to reconsider his position and accept the nomination in '76. Do you think, because of your work with the Kennedys in the past and so on, that under those circumstances, if these different Democratic candidates knock themselves out in Florida, in New Hampshire, and some of these other primaries, that Senator Ted Kennedy might reconsider and accept the nomination?
I doubt it very much. That is the wishful thinking scenario of some people who, as you said, see the candidates, nobody winning very many delegates. What's going to happen, what may very well happen, we have this new rule in the Democratic Party that the winner does not take all in the primary. Mm-hmm. So in each primary, the delegates are divided up according to the number of popular votes cast, either directly for the candidate or for the delegates running on his behalf. And I can envisage a situation, unless somebody runs away with it, and it doesn't look that way now, but somebody might run away with it in the primaries, and if somebody does, he's going to be the nominee, where George Wallace comes to the convention with the most delegates, but with no chance of winning the Democratic Party nomination, and that Senator Jackson, maybe Senator Church, and Congressman Udall, and Fred Harris, a former senator from Oklahoma, who's announced. I'm thinking of announcing after Fred Harris did. I mean, we can all get in there. And these candidates will all come with some delegates, and we will have a brokered convention that takes place out of sight of the television cameras. Now, whether this is more democratic than the old system is a very real question. I'm not sure I like the idea so much, but we'll see. But I think that that this could happen, and if so, they would go to Kennedy and say, "You've got to save the party and the country," and accept the nomination. And remember your brothers up there, and so on. And Kennedy would say, "I said I wasn't going to run, and I'm not going to run." Then I think and this is what I suspect they're counting on and planning for, they would turn next to Senator Humphrey or Senator Muskie, somebody well-known in the country, well-known in the party, who has stayed out of the primaries. I can see that happening. Now, all bets are off, as I said, if somebody wins big in the primaries. But I don't see that happening as of now.
Mrs. Reed.
Mr. Roach, the former board chairman of General Motors, at one point was quoted as saying that planned obsolescence, in my opinion, is another word for progress. And this is another way of saying if we can cheapen the product in order to make more money. In these times when resources are becoming shorter and there is more concern for waste, do you see any trend away from planned obsolescence? Do you see corporations really looking into making the products last?
General Motors is in big trouble right now, and maybe it's because they followed. It seems incredible to me that Roach would say something like that in public. If he did, he's more of an idiot than I ever realized he could be, and he needs a new public relations man or a brain transplant or both. But I think that corporations are affected by. They're not impervious to what's happening, and again, corporations are people who are working in an institution. There's not a corporation does not have a mind or a heart, except for the minds and hearts of the people who work for it. And there is a reflection of this very clearly, and I think we're going to see that in the automobile industry, for example, which may move slowly, like the prehistoric animal. It takes so long for the message to get from the brain to the tail, and there's a long lead time in engineering, design, and getting a product out. But they are going, I think, to be producing more cars that last longer, that people are not going to trade in so fast. It's not just that people trade in their cars long before they become obsolete. And I think people are going to start keeping their cars longer, and that the first thing that's going to become obsolete is Mr. Roach.
Do you have any idea why the auto industry has been so slow, other than this Stegosaurus approach? Why have they been so unresponsive to change over the past 20 years when small cars have been coming in from Europe and they have seen this trend? Why have they not responded?
Again, it's a marketplace. I mean, I happen to own a small car, and I like small cars. They use less gas, and they're less expensive, some of them, to buy in the first place. But the automobile companies found that people continued to buy big cars, loaded with all these options. Nobody had the strength to open the window of the car. You have to have a button to press, for the window to go up and down. And I don't think the automobile companies were being unresponsive to the people who came into their showrooms. And as I think you may be aware, right now the biggest glut is in the small cars, not in the big cars.
Dr. Wright.
I've got a couple of questions here, but I don't think Tony will ever give me a chance to ask them both. So I've got to fire this one out here because I'm particularly interested in this. You're in the world of finance and deal with the securities business. And lately, a number of economists have been saying that the banks in this country are on shaky ground. There have been articles in a number of magazines, including some which would surprise a few people, regarding the banks and their status in this country. I'm wondering if you think the banks are overextended and are maybe headed for some real disastrous trouble in this country.
I think the banks have had something of a little scare this last year. And Martin Mayer's book about the banking system which in many ways is quite a good book, and I think it's a very useful book for people to read, has attracted public attention to the state of the banking industry in this country. But my own impression is that banks are sound, that when you have a recession and you have unemployment and loans that look to be okay when they were made, go on your problem loan list, because the individuals or the companies that you've loaned the money to have gotten into trouble. But the banks that have failed, the Franklin National Bank in New York, is a very special case. There they were trying to move from Long Island into the New York City market, and they wanted to join the big boys, and they wanted to do it too fast. So they would take the loans, they would do the loans that the big boys didn't take, which meant the quality of their loan portfolio was not as good as that of the big banks. And they spent a lot of money on physical plants, so they had to make that up in return on their loans. And of course, the lower the quality of the loan, the more interest you can get. So then they tried to make up more money by legal, but speculating in foreign currencies, and they ran into enormous problems there. But the Franklin National Bank is a special case. The bank in San Diego, the Westgate Bank, is a very special case involving fraud. The bank in New York, the Sterling National Bank, which was acquired recently out of necessity by a chemical bank, a forced acquisition by the regulatory authorities, is a case of a bank trying to expand too fast. But we have the FDIC now, where bank deposits are insured. People aren't going to make a run on the banks, and I think the banking system is sound in this country, and we're certainly not faced with anything like the problems of 1930, 31, 32.
Mr. Sorensen, I'll have to bring to conclusion. Dr. Wright, you could have another question, but we ran out of time. I want to thank you so much for being with us today, and it's been one of our outstanding programs. You have stimulated our thinking in many areas. Thank you.
I've enjoyed being here very much.
I thank the panel again for outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today has been Mr. Thomas Sorensen, speaking to us about bigness in government and in labor, in business, and in many other areas that we like to get into from time to time. I would like to invite you to be with us again next week when we'll be interviewing another personality of the United States or the Northwest. And thank you for joining us.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.